Now, Jimsonweed is an extremely dangerous plant. It can be deadly. So it's important to know how to identify it so that way you do not poison yourself or your family members. If we take a little bit of a step back from this Jimsonweed, you can see all of this plant growing here, and this is Jimsonweed. Now it's growing in a landscaped area, as you guys can see here. I'll kind of pan over there so you can see some of the other plants. And this is actually a plant that does grow wild here in the United States. However, I have not found it very much, so I was very excited to be able to come down here and film this plant. If we look at its growth form, we're actually going to notice that the plant is kind of bushy almost in appearance and kind of vine-like in the way that it grows. We can see these very distinct leaves that look somewhat like nightshade leaves. So let's take a closer look at these leaves. Whenever we look at the leaves of Jimsonweed, we're going to notice that first off, we're going to notice were these very distinct teeth or lobe-like teeth running along the margins or the edges of the leaves. And these leaves are somewhat spear-shaped and somewhat egg-shaped in appearance, and they kind of resemble nightshade leaves, if you might notice some of the resemblance between some nightshade species that I've also shown on this channel. If we look at the top side of the leaf, we're going to notice that it is kind of just a rather bright green, and it is towards the end of fall, or the beginning of fall, I should say. And so these leaves are starting to lose some of their chlorophyll, as we can see these leaves starting to gain some yellowing here on the back. If we flip the leaf over, we're going to notice that it is a little bit lighter in appearance than the top of the leaf, which is just a little bit darker. Whenever we get to the top of the plant, we're going to notice that the leaves will kind of grow in like a whorl-like pattern, like we can see how these are coming out here, all off the same leaf stem. And if we look over here, we're going to notice this large singular leaf. So there is a couple of different growth forms and growth patterns to these leaves. Some of these leaves are rather large, like this one, that almost covers up the entirety of my hand. And some of them are a little smaller, like this one, which is about the size of my index finger. And once we get towards the base of the plant, near the ground, we're going to notice that there are no leaves on the base and the main stem at the base of the plant where it meets the ground. We'll also notice that once we get towards the top of the soil, or mulch in this case, that we're going to see some purple tinging running up the stems. Now these stems and this purple tinging is another unique factor about this plant, because as we get further up the plant, we're going to notice that this purple tinging becomes a lot more prominent once we get towards the tips of each one of these main stems of this plant. Now this plant has kind of like a bushy and somewhat viney-like appearance. It's normally classified as a vine. And some people will actually confuse this plant with wild potato vine because the leaves, while they don't look similar, the flowers are what's going to look the most similar. But this vining growth form and these purple tinges is something that sometimes confuses people. But if you pay attention to this purple tinging, you're not going to be able to confuse this plant with wild potato vine. Jimsonweed has very distinct seed pods like we can see here, these very hard, spiky, egg-shaped things, and these spikes are extremely tough. If you were to grab it hard, it would stab you and it would make you bleed, so be very careful if you are touching this plant. But these are the seed pods, and these seed pods will form after the plant has flowered. Now it is towards the beginning of fall in my area in central Indiana, so this plant has already gone to flower. I will actually show you guys a picture of what the flower looks like so you guys can get an idea of it, and I will describe it when I show that picture. But these are the seed pods, and these seeds are actually the most dangerous part of the plant. Some people will use this plant to try to hallucinate, and that's not a good idea because this plant has a chemical known as scopolamine that is basically a parasympathetic nerve paralyzer. So it'll actually damage your parasympathetic nerves, and it has caused people to not be able to breathe. It has caused people to go into paralysis. It causes very violent and delirium type hallucinations. So do not consume this plant. Now let's take a look at some of these seeds, because some of these seed pods are fully formed and the seeds are about to come out. If we look inside of this open seed pod here, we're going to notice that it opens in a rather unique way. We're going to notice it has kind of like a plus sign or a cross going through the center of it, and we can see all of these little black seeds inside of it. And these seeds are the most dangerous and most potent part of the plant. So make sure you do not harvest these seeds thinking that you're going to get some delicious seeds for your smoothies, because it will be a very, very bad day if you do. Whenever we look at the stem of Jimsonweed, we're going to notice that it'll branch off in sort of an opposite pattern like we can see here, and we can see here, and we can also see that opposite branching pattern up here. And this plant will grow kind of like this along the ground and kind of vine along the ground. And then you'll see these sections that start to grow up tall, kind of like this, making it look from a distance like a bush, but it's technically classified as a vine. The stems of this plant are very, very stiff. They're not woody, but they are extremely stiff. They feel rather woody, but if you kind of tap it with your thumbnail or your fingernail, you're going to notice there is a little bit of give to it. So it does kind of have a very stiff texture to it. There's no distinct feeling. It is smooth and it is round. There's no hairs, there's no bristles, there's no spikes, there's no bloom, there's no waxy coating on it. It's just a very, very stiff, round, smooth stem with the sort of purple tinging that we can see here. We can actually see the further we go down this plant here on this part of the stem, we can see it turning more and more green, and we can see it becoming extremely green down there at the base. Now right here we can see the flower of Jimsonweed, and since this plant's flowering period is over in my neck of the woods here in central Indiana, I had to download a picture of the flower so that way I could discuss them with all of you guys. So right here we are seeing the very white and very trumpet-like flower of the Jimsonweed plant, and whenever you look at it towards the very tips of the petals, you're going to notice these very long kind of spike-like appendages, if you will, growing out from the tips of the petals. So this is a very, very easy to identify flower. However, it does resemble a wild potato vine flower, which is also white and has a trumpet-like appearance. However, Jimsonweed will have these spike-like appendages coming out of the tips of the petals versus the wild potato vine will not have these appendages. There's another interesting feature about the flowers of Jimsonweed, and we'll see them in this picture, where the flower petals and the tips, those spike-like appendages, kind of seem to twist a little bit versus being just more like a straight trumpet. And now here we can see the flower of the wild potato vine as somewhat of a comparison between Jimsonweed and wild potato vine, so that way you guys can get an idea of the differences of these plants by their flowers. So that's how you guys can identify Jimsonweed. I want to reiterate that this is an extremely poisonous plant, and do not consume this plant. Touching it won't hurt you, most likely. Some people might have an allergy to it, so I do want to mention that. Now, blue flag iris will generally bloom around the middle towards the end of May in my area of central Indiana. And we can notice this very, very distinct flower here with this kind of yellow tips towards the tips of the petals. Whenever we look at the petals, we're going to notice that there are these veins kind of running through the petals that are very, very distinct, and they are like a dark indigo sort of color. And whenever we look at the flower, we're also going to notice there are 6 petals. We have these 3 big ones with the yellow tips towards the end of them, and we have these 3 little smaller ones. The color is going to be indigo. It's sort of going towards the throat of the flower. It's going to turn into white, like I said, with these yellow tips. If we turn the flower over, we're going to notice that the underside of the flower in the center is going to have this sort of greenish appearance. So make sure you kind of keep that in mind. Now, whenever we look at the leaves of our blue flag iris, we're going to notice these veins running parallel down the length of these blade-like or sword-like leaves. If we count them, we're also going to be able to count 4 leaves coming out of the ground here. So 1, 2, 3, and then 4. And this is going to hold true on every of the blue flag iris that you are going to run across. If we zoom in and look at the margins of the leaves, we are going to notice that they are smooth, so there are no serrations on these leaves. Right here we can see the leaves of the blue flag iris, and they look somewhat grass-like, and they resemble cattail leaves very strongly. So make sure that you pay very close attention to the growth form of this plant before you harvest it if you're thinking you're going for cattail, because the growth form is vastly different. The blue flag iris generally will grow in large clumps and colonies like we can see right here in front of us, where it looks like all this really tall grass kind of growing here in this low swampland. Now let's take a close look at the part of the plant that's closest to the ground, because this is what's most important to differentiate this plant from cattail. Now, whenever you're trying to differentiate cattail from blue flag iris, you want to get down close towards the ground, because your blue flag iris will fan out Just like we can see here how all these leaves are fanning out. And if we turn it somewhat to the side here, you can see that it's flat. Now your cattails are going to be round, so let's take a look at a cattail really quick for comparison. Okay, now here we have the leaves of the common cattail. Now we can see these leaves look very, very similar to our blue flag iris. However, if we look down towards the base of the plant at the ground, we're going to notice that the cattail is actually round. See, if I turn this around, you can actually see that it's just almost perfectly circular towards the base. And as we go further up, we're going to see those leaves sort of splay out on the cattail. Another one of the major differences between these two is not only their flowers, because you can obviously see these purple flowers here of this blue flag iris, and cattail has a very distinct sort of corn dog looking sort of flower situation going on. But we're also going to notice the height. Your blue flag iris will generally only grow around 3.5 to maybe 4 feet in height, versus your cattails, like we can see here, is already close. This is about 4.5 feet already, but they can get much taller. Cattails can grow about 6 to 7 feet in height. So the height difference is something else to pay attention to. Now this is a really common plant that you guys might be finding along the edges of roadsides, old agricultural fields, even in your lawn and garden. Like right now, this one that we're looking at is growing right up against my mini barn, right here in my yard. And you can see a couple more over here, and you can see one growing right here. And then if we look over here, we can actually see some more growing in this old torn up raised bed. Now this is an incredibly easy plant to identify, and some people will confuse this from a distance with wintercress. However, if you look really closely, we're going to notice these flowers are not only a little bit more numerous than wintercress, but their petals are also a lot more numerous. If we look at these flowers, we're going to count anywhere from 15 to 20 petals per flower, and the flowers are kind of growing in like a radiant disc, kind of like what you would expect in like a dandelion sort of situation where the flowers are radiant around. So these are really, really easy to identify. Now let's take a closer look at this. Whenever we look up close, we're going to see all these little flower buds. You can see all these little flower buds coming out here at the top and all these mess of flowers. And each plant can actually produce, each butterweed plant can actually produce dozens and dozens, if not over 100 flowers per plant, as we can see here just on, as we can see here just on these two. This one back here is a different one. We can see on these here all of these flowers, and if we go down the plant, we'll actually notice in the, we'll actually notice in the nodes more flower buds will start to come out. And we can see this stem coming out of the leaf node where the, we can actually see this stem growing out of the leaf node where the leaf petiole joins the main stem, and we're going to see even more flower buds. And this is a very typical feature of butterweed. And now there are several other plants that are called butterweed. So I want you guys to keep that in mind, that not every plant called butterweed is the exact same. Now this plant can grow to varying heights, and the ones that we're looking at in front of us are probably about 3 feet tall, versus this one over here is about 3.5 feet tall. And then we have these little ones growing here that are only maybe about 1 foot to 1.5 feet tall. So there's going to be a lot of variation in height in your butterweed. And some are also going to have variation in how far the leaves are spaced out. We can see on these, the leaves are actually a little bit more spaced out, versus on these, the leaves are a little bit more dense in the way that they're growing. So let's take a look at the growth form of these leaves. If we get down towards the bottom of the plant, we're going to notice that the leaves will grow in a basal, rosette, or a circular fashion, as we can see here at the basal leaves. Now these leaves are very deeply notched, and all of the leaves on this plant are deeply notched. However, if we go a little bit up the plant, not only do the leaves get much larger, if we look close, we can see there's actually a little bit of a wing, if you will, like right here, and then right here we can see this little wing growing along the leaf stem. Versus on the basal leaves, we don't really notice that little green wing of the leaves. Now once we get towards the top of the plant, we're going to notice a little bit more different of a leaf shape. They're still very deeply notched, but not as deeply notched as the lower leaves. And this is literally right underneath the very top of the flowers here. And we can see these stems coming out, producing more flower buds. Now, as we look on the main stem and the nodes, we're going to notice this little purple tinging or purple striation. That's kind of an important feature for Pachyra glabella, or this species of butterweed. Another thing that we're going to notice, if we look at the leaves, they will grow in an alternating pattern. So we can see this leaf growing down here by my pinky, and then this one up over here. So these leaves are going to alternate on different sides of the stem going up the plant. And we can see how these leaves start to get a little bit smaller once we get toward the very, very top. And then the largest leaves are usually going to be about midway on the plant. Like we can see here, this leaf takes up pretty much my entire hand. The leaves can get really, really large. Another thing we're going to notice about the leaves is that they are somewhat toothed, though they're not serrated like you would expect to see on something like a nettle, or they're also not as deeply toothed like you would see on like a wintercress species. And if we go down the plant, you can see again what I'm talking about, these very shallow teeth growing along the margins of the leaves. Now the stem of butterweed is round, green, and it feels kind of stiff, but you squish it, it does have a bit of give to it because the inside of the stem is hollow. This is one of the main methods of this plant to transport water and nutrients up and down the plant, so that way it can distribute the nutrients evenly. Also, if we look at the stem, we can see that it does have these very deep notches or grooves running lengthwise down the entire stem. And this is another key feature of Pachyra glabella that separates it from a few other butterweed species. Now again, this is a really easy plant to identify, and something to keep in mind is this plant is poisonous. It's poisonous to not only humans, but also livestock as well. So this is something that you kind of want to keep in mind, like if you have a farm or a homestead, then you definitely want to make sure that your animals aren't eating this plant because it can actually cause symptoms of poisoning. This plant does have some medicinal uses, but I'm not going to talk about those because it's a little too dangerous for me to cover those, and I'm also not terribly familiar with its medicinal uses. But this plant is known to be poisonous to pretty much all mammal species, so make sure you keep that in mind, that whenever you're seeing this plant covering agricultural fields this time of year, that does not mean that you can just go out and harvest it and eat it. Something else you might notice on the stem of butterweed is that on the edges of the grooves, you might notice these purple striations running lengthwise up and down the stem. Now, not every plant is going to have this. Like, for example, if we look at this one, it's a lot more faint on this plant than it is on this plant. Now, if we look at this one, again towards the base, we can see it on one side, but not so much on the other side. So there is going to be a little bit of variation in this purple tinging and these purple striations running along the stem. And now these purple striations will start to disappear the higher you go up the plant, and the stem will just start to turn more green. Hey guys, I wanted to give all of you another comparison of white snakeroot. This time, however, we're going to compare it to wood nettle. We are looking at these two plants because some viewers of mine thought that they looked similar, and they're right. They do look very similar. So let's take a look at these two plants and see the differences between them. The first thing that you're going to notice is that wood nettle and stinging nettle are both stinging plants, whereas white snakeroot is not. That is by far the easiest way to tell these plants apart in the wild. Nettles will have urticating hairs running through the length of the stem, while white snakeroot just has hairs on the stem, but they do not sting. Those stinging hairs on nettle are responsible for that burning and stinging sensation that we get whenever we touch them. The leaves of these plants do look very similar in that they are ovate in shape, with teeth or serrations running down the margins or sides of the leaves. Wood nettle has an alternating leaf pattern, while white snakeroot has an opposite leaf pattern. The color between the leaves of both of these plants is another major difference because white snakeroot will have very dark green leaves, whereas the leaves of wood nettle are much more brightly green in color. The flowers are very different as well in both of the plants. White snakeroot will have white flowers clustered towards the top of the plant, and wood nettle will have greenish yellow colored flowers clustered towards the top of the plant. The flower colors of these two is a great way to tell them apart when they're in flowering season, which is usually around the same time, from mid-July all the way up until middle of September, depending on where you live. The flowers of white snakeroot are closely bunched together, and the flowers of wood nettle are spread a little bit further apart. Telling the difference between these two plants is extremely easy if you just take time and look at the details of each one of these plants. Another one of the major differences is the growing environment that both of these plants like. Wood nettle will grow in very moist areas, like along creek and river bottoms, but white snakeroot will grow in higher up areas. However, it can also grow in moist woodlands and fields. You can even find white snakeroot growing in your lawn, like on the edges of fences and fence rows, and you can even find it in some clearings that you may have on your property that you may not always mow.
All right, now right here, this is a plant that a lot of people will confuse with common milkweed. One of the reasons is the leaf shape is nearly identical, and if I were to pull this off, it would lactate and spit out kind of a white, sappy liquid substance. Okay, but one of the best ways to tell is if you look at the stem, we can actually see that this is reddish purple in color versus your common milkweed will be totally green. So make sure you guys keep that in mind. This is Dogbane. This is a poisonous plant. So make sure you do not forage this thinking that it's common milkweed. It will get you very, very sick. And here we can see a couple more. You can see what I'm talking about, that reddish, purplish hue all around the entirety of the stem, except for once you get towards the very, very top. Now, one of the reasons that people will commonly forage this instead of milkweed is they're going for young milkweed shoots. And whenever this plant's shooting, whenever it's only a few inches in height, it'll just be green. We won't have this reddish purplish coloring that we can see here along the stem. And so people will gather this instead of milkweed. So I want to point that out to you guys, so that way you guys are aware what the differences are. Now, whenever you have the young shoots, one thing you're going to notice about your Dogbane is it has kind of like this whitish bloom substance on it that rubs off with your fingers. Versus common milkweed is somewhat hairy, just very slightly hairy. And this is perfectly smooth stem. There's no hairs on this stem. So keep that in